Hello everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In today's video, James faces the toughest decision of his life when his father calls from overseas with an ultimatum. Leave Vietnam to work with him and give up his relationship with Diep, or risk losing his family's approval forever. The tension rises as James defends the woman he loves and the little girl they're raising together, even threatening to cut ties with his father if he continues to interfere. Watch until the very end to see whether love and courage can overcome family pride. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The fading sunset poured a warm, orange glow through the curtains as James sat across from his mother at the small wooden table. Her brows furrowed with a tension he had rarely seen. Taking a deep breath, she began softly, "James, I just spoke with your father. He called from abroad. He wants you to leave Vietnam and work with him overseas." James looked up sharply, disbelief flickering across his face. Now? Why? Her eyes softened with both worry and sadness. "Your father believes it's time for you to join him in the business, but that's not all." Her voice lowered. "He knows about Diep and Nai. He doesn't approve. He thinks Diep is not suitable because she has no parents, comes from a poor background, and has adopted a child. He has already chosen someone else he believes is more appropriate for you." James's chest tightened as her words sank in. He could almost hear his father's stern voice in his mind, commands masked as advice, every sentence dripping with the weight of family expectations. "What?" James's voice was sharp now. "He wants me to leave everything behind, to abandon Diep and Nai?" His mother nodded reluctantly. "He said if you come abroad to work with him, he will personally introduce you to this other woman." James's fists tightened until his knuckles turned white. He stood, pacing the room, his jaw clenched. Memories of Diep's quiet strength flashed through his mind, her courage in raising Nai, her kind eyes that carried both pain and hope. Nai's innocent laughter echoed in his heart like a plea. "No," James said firmly, his voice carrying a quiet fury. "I won't leave. I won't let him decide my life." His mother reached for his arm. "James, listen. Your father is stubborn, and he will not give up easily. He believes he is protecting you." James turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Protecting me? By tearing apart the family I am building? Diep and Nai are my family. If he cannot see that, then he will lose me." The silence in the room grew heavy. Outside, the first stars began to pierce the twilight sky. His mother looked at her son, a complex mix of pride and worry softening her gaze. "Are you certain? This could create a rift you may never mend." James inhaled deeply, the decision already carved into his heart. "Mother, tell father this. If he continues to stand in the way of my love for Diep, I will walk away from him. I will take Diep and Nai to another place, start over, and build a life far from his shadow." Tears welled in his mother's eyes, but she nodded, her voice trembling with quiet strength. "I will tell him. And James," she placed a hand on his shoulder, "I support you, always." A wave of relief mingled with sorrow washed over James. The path ahead would not be easy. His father's opposition would be fierce. Yet the thought of Diep's smile and Nai's laughter steeled his resolve. Later that evening, James found Diep outside the small fruit stall where she sold grapefruits. The moon hung low, casting a pale light over her figure as she packed the day's earnings. "Diep," he called gently, his voice carrying both warmth and urgency. She looked up, surprise softening into a smile. "James, what brings you here at this hour?" He stepped closer, the weight of the evening heavy in his chest. "I needed to see you," he said simply. Diep tilted her head, sensing his unease. "What happened?" James hesitated, searching her eyes for courage. "My father called. He wants me to leave Vietnam and work with him abroad. But more than that, he doesn't approve of us. He believes you're not right for me because of your past, because you're raising Nye." Diep's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of hurt. She looked down, her hands tightening on the basket she carried. "I see." James reached out, gently lifting her chin. "Listen to me. None of that matters. You and Nee are my life. My father wants to introduce me to someone else, but I refuse. I told my mother that if he continues to stand in our way, I'll cut ties. I'll leave with you and Nye to build a life far from his control." Diep's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. "James, you would give up your family for me?" "For us," James corrected softly. "For the family we are creating together. You, me, and Nye." Her eyes glistened, tears forming, but not falling. "James, I don't want to be the reason you fight with your father." He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You are not the reason. Love is the reason. The future we dream of is the reason. And I will protect it, no matter what." The night air carried the scent of ripened fruit and cool earth as Diep leaned into his embrace. For a moment, the world was quiet, the tension of the day melting away beneath the steady rhythm of their hearts. James held her close, whispering, "We'll face whatever comes, together." The moonlight bathed them in silver, a silent witness to their unbreakable bond. Their love, defiant and pure, stood as a shield against the storm brewing beyond the horizon. The next morning, James's mother stood by the open window, the soft morning light touching her features. She held her phone tightly, waiting for the international call to connect. The line clicked, and his father's deep, commanding voice came through. "I assume you've spoken to James," he said. "I have," she replied evenly. "And will he come?" Her gaze drifted toward the garden where James and Nye played under the rising sun. "No," she said firmly. "He has made his choice. He will not abandon Diep or Nye. If you continue to oppose him, he will walk away. He said he will leave this place with them and start a new life." A long silence stretched across the line. His father's voice, when it finally came, was low and heavy. He would defy his own father for a woman like her? "For the woman he loves," she corrected softly, "and for the child they are raising together." The call ended abruptly, the silence in the room almost deafening. She turned to watch her son laughing with Nye, Diep smiling nearby. In that moment, she knew James's decision was not a loss. It was the beginning of a new legacy, built not on tradition or wealth, but on love and courage. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen window, bathing the room in soft golden light. James sat at the table with a quiet intensity, his mind replaying the heated conversation with his father. The sound of Nee's giggles floated from the yard where she played with a ball, a sweet reminder of what truly mattered. Diep wiped her hands on a towel and glanced at him, sensing the storm that lingered behind his eyes. "What did your father say?" she asked gently, setting a cup of tea in front of him. James let out a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the cup. He hung up. No promises, no acceptance, just silence. Diep's lips tightened. She slid into the chair across from him, her voice soft but firm. It won't be easy for him. Parents hold on to their own dreams for their children. James reached across the table, taking her hands in his. "Diep, you are my dream. You and Nee are my family. I can't live chasing someone else's idea of what my life should be." Her eyes softened, but worry flickered in their depths. "I don't want to be the reason you lose your father." "You're not the reason," James said, his voice steady. "This is about him refusing to see what happiness looks like for me. If he cannot accept that, then the distance between us was always there." The room fell quiet, except for the distant sounds of Nee's laughter. The tea cooled slowly, untouched. That evening, James's mother returned from the market, carrying a small basket of vegetables. She paused in the doorway when she saw the couple sitting together, their hands clasped as if drawing strength from one another. "I called him again," she said softly, setting the basket on the counter. "Your father is furious, but he's listening. He didn't hang up this time." James stood, a flicker of hope crossing his face. "What did he say?" "He asked why you'd risk everything for a woman he barely knows," she replied, her voice calm. "I told him to remember the woman who saved his life, the woman who rushed to help when no one else did. I told him to remember that Diep is the reason he is still here to judge anyone at all." Diep's eyes widened in surprise, her voice trembling. "You told him that?" His mother smiled faintly. "Yes, and I told him that a father who cannot see his son's happiness is the one truly losing family." James felt a swell of gratitude toward his mother. He stepped forward, taking her hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. She squeezed his fingers. "Your father is stubborn, but he loves you, even if pride blinds him. Give him time." Days passed. The tension remained like a storm cloud, but there were small shifts, longer pauses in his father's calls, fewer harsh words, an occasional sigh instead of anger. James stayed focused on his daily life, working in the fields, helping Diep with the fruit stall, and laughing with Nai as she chased dragonflies along the path. One morning, as the roosters crowed and the village stirred awake, James's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was his father. His heart pounded as he answered, "Father." For a long moment, only silence. Then a deep, tired voice came through. "Your mother tells me you are determined." "I am," James replied, his voice firm but respectful. "Diep and Nai are my family. I love them, and nothing will change that." His father exhaled slowly. "She has no parents, no wealth. The world will whisper behind your back." "Let them whisper," James said. "What matters is the life we build, not the gossip of strangers." Another pause, longer this time. "Your mother says she saved my life," his father said quietly. "I had forgotten. I was so focused on appearances, I did not see what truly matters." James felt his chest tighten. She did. She didn't care who you were. She only wanted to help. A heavy sigh came from the other end. "I cannot promise to approve immediately, but I will not stand in your way." Relief washed over James like a tide. "Thank you, Father. I only ask one thing," his father added, his tone softening. "Take care of them. Make sure they are truly happy." "I promise," James said, his voice thick with emotion. When James ended the call, he turned to see Diep standing in the doorway, Nee's small hand in hers. Their faces were full of questions. James smiled, a rare lightness in his eyes. "He's not against us anymore. He said he won't stop us." Diep gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Nye clapped her little hands, not fully understanding, but sensing the joy in the air. Tears welled in Diep's eyes as she stepped forward. "James, it means we can finally live without fear," he said, pulling her into an embrace. Nye giggled and wrapped her arms around both of them, her small frame squeezing between them like the final piece of a puzzle. James's mother watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She wiped away a tear before anyone could see. That evening, the family gathered beneath a sky dusted with stars. The scent of night-blooming flowers mingled with the gentle breeze. They shared a simple meal: fresh fruit, warm rice, and laughter that danced in the air like music. James raised his cup of tea, his eyes meeting Diep's. "To us," he said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "To the family we chose and the love we fought for." Diep lifted her cup, her smile radiant. "To love," she whispered. Nye raised her little cup of water, copying them. "To family," she exclaimed, making everyone laugh. James looked around the table, his heart full. He thought of the long road that had brought them here, the arguments, the fears, the silent prayers. He thought of his father's reluctant acceptance and his mother's steadfast support. For the first time in weeks, the weight on his shoulders lifted completely. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if blessing the promise they had all silently made, to stand together, no matter what storms might come. The night deepened, carrying the sound of their laughter into the dark. In that moment, James knew they had built something stronger than tradition, stronger than pride. They had built a family bound by love, and nothing, no distance, no disapproval could ever break it.